The chandeliers of Pemberton House cast their golden light across the assembled glitter of London society, each crystal prism fracturing illumination into 1,000 dancing fragments that shimmered across silk gowns and jeweled throats, transforming the ballroom into a constellation of earthbound stars, where the season's most ambitious families displayed their treasures and their schemes with equal brilliance. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of hothouse flowers, expensive perfumes, and beeswax candles, while the orchestra's strings wove melodies that floated above the constant murmur of conversation, laughter, and the whispered calculations of matchmaking mothers. Yet at the periphery of this glittering assembly, partially obscured by a marble column adorned with climbing roses, stood Lady Beatrice Ashworth, a figure so still she might have been carved from the same stone that supported her solitude. Her gown of deep violet, appropriate for her half-mourning, was well made but simple, lacking the elaborate embellishments that marked the ambitious debutantes who swirled across the dance floor like brilliant birds, displaying plumage meant to attract the most advantageous notice. She was 28, young in years but ancient in society's cruel arithmetic that measured a woman's worth by her prospects rather than her person. Widowed, these 18 months passed after a brief marriage to the elderly Lord Ashworth, a kindly man who had offered respectability in exchange for companionship in his declining years. Beatrice had been left with little beyond a modest annuity and the dubious distinction of her title. The Tun had initially shown her the perfunctory sympathy due to grief, but when it became apparent that her inheritance would not attract new suitors of consequence, she had been quietly relegated to that shadowed territory occupied by those deemed no longer relevant to society's endless matrimonial campaigns. She watched the dancers with an expression that revealed nothing, neither envy nor disdain, neither longing nor bitterness, her dark eyes observing the patterns of the assembly with the detachment of a scholar studying specimens beneath glass. Here was Lady Wilmington, steering her daughter toward Lord Cunningham with all the subtlety of a general positioning troops. There was the Honourable Miss Fairfax, laughing with calculated brightness at some jest made by the wealthy but tedious Mr. Pemberton. Everywhere, the ancient dance of ambition and acquisition played out in three-quarter time, as it had for generations, as it would for generations hence. Beatrice had learned to find a strange peace in her invisibility, this freedom that came from being overlooked and therefore unscrutinized. Then the ballroom's atmosphere shifted with the perceptible change that accompanies the entrance of consequence, and the assembled company turned as one toward the grand staircase where the Duke of Rothwell had appeared, his presence commanding immediate attention despite the fact that he had spoken not a word. He descended with unhurried grace, his evening clothes impeccable, his expression carved from winter itself, beautiful in the way that frozen landscapes possess beauty, admirable from a distance, but forbidding intimacy. His reputation preceded him like a winter wind, the savage Duke, London's most fearsome peer, whose cutting tongue had reduced grown men to stammering apology and sent ambitious mothers fleeing with their daughters in tow, whose fortune and title made him the season's greatest prize, even as his cruel demeanor made him its greatest peril. The Duke's progress through the ballroom carried with it the weight of glacial inevitability, and Beatrice observed with detached interest as the assembly parted before him like water before the prow of a great ship, the ambitious mothers pulling their daughters back with expressions that mingled hope and terror in equal measure. For while his title and fortune made him the most desirable match in England, his savage reputation made approach a calculated risk that only the most desperate or foolish dared attempt. Lady Hartwick made the attempt first, propelling her eldest daughter forward with a hand pressed firmly against the girl's back, and the poor child, Miss Amelia Hartwick, barely 17 and trembling visibly, executed a curtsy so deep she nearly lost her balance. "Your Grace," Lady Hartwick simpered, her voice carrying across the sudden quiet that had descended upon their corner of the room. "Surely you remember my daughter Amelia from the Duchess of Marlborough's garden party. Such a talented girl. She plays the pianoforte quite brilliantly, and her watercolors have been much admired." The Duke's pale eyes settled upon the mother and daughter with the clinical interest one might afford an insect discovered beneath an overturned stone, and when he spoke, his voice carried perfectly across the hushed assembly, each word enunciated with devastating clarity. "I make it a policy, madam, never to remember anything that makes so little impression upon first encounter, and I fear your daughter's accomplishments, however brilliant you may find them, fall squarely into that category of forgettable mediocrity that characterizes most young ladies thrust upon my notice by their grasping mothers. The colour drained from Lady Hartwick's face as though he had struck her, and poor Miss Amelia's eyes filled with tears that she blinked back furiously. Her hands clenched so tightly in her skirts that her knuckles showed white. But the Duke had already moved past them with the dismissive ease of one who has dispatched an inconvenience, his attention already elsewhere, and the watching crowd released a collective breath. 2 more attempts followed in swift succession, Mrs. Pemberton with her second daughter, Lady Quinton with her niece, and each received similar treatment, the Duke's cutting words delivered with such precise cruelty that Beatrice found herself both appalled and oddly fascinated by the surgical precision with which he dismantled their pretensions, exposing the mercenary calculations beneath their simpering courtesy. Then Lady Pemberton, stung by her daughter's public humiliation and seeking to restore her own consequence through the time-honored method of elevating herself by diminishing another, turned her attention toward Beatrice's shadowed corner, her voice pitched to carry across the assembled company with the false sweetness of poisoned honey. "Though I suppose," she declared, her fan snapping open with theatrical emphasis, "the Duke need not concern himself with ambitious debutantes when there are always desperate widows lurking about the edges of respectable society, hoping their mourning weeds might inspire pity sufficient to secure a second chance at consequence. Poor dear Lady Ashworth must find these gatherings quite torturous, surrounded by so much youth and promise, while possessing neither." The laughter that followed was not kind, and Beatrice felt the familiar cold wash of humiliation move through her, but she had learned long ago that dignity was armor more effective than any defense, so she remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged, her hands resting calmly at her sides, refusing to give Lady Pemberton the satisfaction of visible reaction. Yet across the ballroom, through the crowd of glittering guests, the Duke's pale eyes had found her, and something in his expression shifted, some calculation rearranging itself behind that frozen facade, and Beatrice felt the weight of his regard settle upon her, like winter sunlight, cold, penetrating, and inexplicably unsettling in ways she could not yet begin to name. 3 days later, Beatrice sought refuge in the place she had always found solace when society's casual cruelties pressed too heavily upon her spirit. Hatchard's bookshop on Piccadilly, where the scent of leather bindings and printer's ink created an atmosphere of sanctuary that no ballroom could match, and where the accumulated wisdom of centuries stood waiting in patient rows, indifferent to rank or fortune, or the arbitrary judgments that governed the world beyond those walls. She moved through the narrow aisles with the easy familiarity of long acquaintance, her fingers trailing along the spines of volumes both familiar and unknown, seeking that particular edition of Marcus Aurelius she had read about in the Times literary supplement, when a voice behind her, cold and precise as winter itself, shattered her peaceful solitude with a single cutting observation. "Philosophy," the Duke of Rothwell remarked, his tone carrying that same devastating precision she had witnessed at the ball. "How remarkably predictable that a lady seeking to distinguish herself from the common run of female accomplishment should turn to the ancients for her pretension to depth. One supposes next you will claim a fondness for Plato, and perhaps venture an opinion on the categorical imperative." Beatrice turned slowly, fixing him with a gaze that held neither the fear nor the desperate eagerness that usually greeted his notice, her voice when she spoke carrying the calm certainty of one who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing to protect. "I seek no distinction, Your Grace, for I have learned that seeking notice from those incapable of perceiving substance beyond surface is a fool's errand. And as for my reading choices, they are my own affair and require neither your approval nor your cutting commentary, in which I observe you distribute with the generosity of one who mistakes cruelty for cleverness." Something flickered in those pale eyes, surprise perhaps, or irritation, and he moved closer, his considerable height forcing her to tilt her chin upward to maintain eye contact, but she refused to step back, refused to cede ground to his intimidation. "You are either remarkably brave or remarkably foolish, Lady Ashworth, to speak to me with such frank disregard for consequences. Most ladies of your station would recognize the imprudence of antagonizing a duke." She allowed herself the ghost of a smile, bitter and knowing. "Most ladies of my station have prospects to protect, and ambitions to nurture your grace, whereas I have neither, which affords me the luxury of honesty that your title generally prevents you from encountering, and I find I quite prefer Aurelius to your company, for he at least offers wisdom rather than mere condescension dressed as conversation." She turned back to the shelves, selecting her volume with deliberate care, and moved past him toward the shopkeeper's counter, her spine straight, her movements unhurried, as though dismissing a duke held no more significance than dismissing a troublesome thought. Behind her, she heard him draw breath to speak, but she did not pause, did not turn, did not grant him the satisfaction of her continued attention, and by the time he recovered sufficiently to follow, she had completed her purchase and departed into the afternoon sunlight, leaving the Duke of Rothwell standing alone among the books, for the first time in recent memory, rendered speechless by a woman who had treated his consequence with the same indifference society showed to hers. And the unfamiliar sensation settling in his chest felt disturbingly like fascination. The Duke of Rothwell stood at the window of his study that evening, his reflection ghostly in the rain-streaked glass, and found himself contemplating the unsettling reality that a woman he had known for less than a week occupied more space in his thoughts than any person had managed in the 5 years since Charlotte Fairfax had shattered what remained of his capacity for trust. For Charlotte, with her golden curls and practiced smiles, had seemed everything a duchess should be until the night he overheard her, laughing with her true lover about how easily the cold duke had been manipulated, how his title and fortune would secure her position while her heart remained entirely elsewhere. And the memory of that laughter, cruel and dismissive, had forged the armor he wore still, the savage tongue that kept the world at safe distance, the glacial demeanor that ensured no one would mistake his civility for vulnerability ever again. Yet Lady Ashworth had treated his consequence with the same indifference society showed to hers, had met his cutting words not with tears or anger but with calm dismissal, and the unfamiliar sensation settling in his chest felt disturbingly like respect, mingled with something far more dangerous that he dared not yet name. He turned from the window, moving to his desk where he kept the carefully maintained distance between himself and the world, but instead of attending to the correspondence awaiting his attention, he found himself summoning Greaves, his longtime secretary, a man whose discretion had been tested and proven over 2 decades of service. "Make inquiries," the Duke instructed, his voice carrying none of the cutting edge he employed in society, "regarding Lady Beatrice Ashworth, widow of the late Lord Ashworth. I wish to know her circumstances, her character as perceived by those who know her beyond the ballroom, her habits and pursuits, but exercise utmost discretion. I will not have her name connected to mine through servant gossip." Greaves departed with a bow, and the Duke returned to his contemplation, thinking of pale eyes that held neither fear nor calculation, of a spine that remained straight under mockery, of a voice that spoke truth without artifice, and he recognized with uncomfortable clarity that his interest exceeded mere curiosity, that something in her complete indifference to his rank had pierced the armor he had so carefully constructed. For what use was protection against someone who sought nothing from him, who asked for neither his favor nor his fortune, who would likely prefer never to encounter him again? 2 days later, Greaves returned with his report, and the Duke learned what society had dismissed as irrelevant, that Lady Ashworth was known among the merchants and tradespeople for her unfailing courtesy and prompt payment, despite modest means, that she volunteered at a charity school in Cheapside, teaching reading to children whose parents could not afford proper education, that her late husband had been 40 years her senior when they married, a marriage arranged by her impoverished family when she was barely 17, that she had nursed him through his final illness with a devotion he had done nothing to earn, and that she now lived in a small house in an unfashionable quarter. Her only companion, an elderly maid, her only luxury the books she purchased with careful economy from shops like Hatchard's. The Duke absorbed these details with the same focused attention he brought to matters of business and politics, and felt something shift in his carefully maintained worldview, for here was a woman who possessed genuine substance beneath society's dismissal, who had survived circumstances that would have broken a lesser spirit, who had emerged with her dignity and kindness intact, despite every reason to become bitter. And he found himself thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, armor was not strength but merely fear dressed as invulnerability, and that the true courage he had witnessed was not his savage tongue, but her quiet refusal to let cruelty diminish her essential self. The following morning, Beatrice returned to Hatchard seeking a volume on Stoic ethics, and found herself unsurprised yet oddly unsettled when the Duke of Rothwell materialized in the philosophy section as though his presence there were the most natural occurrence in the world, his pale eyes meeting hers with an expression she could not quite decipher, before he remarked, "Lady Ashworth, what a remarkable coincidence to encounter you here again. Though I confess, after our last exchange, I have found myself contemplating Aurelius myself. Perhaps you might recommend where one should begin with the meditations." And she recognized immediately that this was no coincidence at all, that he had somehow learned her habits and arranged this meeting. Yet she could not bring herself to flee, as instinct demanded, and instead responded with careful neutrality. Book 2, Your Grace, where he writes of the soul's capacity to maintain tranquility regardless of external circumstance, though I suspect you have little need of such philosophy, given your apparent imperviousness to the opinions of others. 3 days later, she visited the British Museum to study the Elgin marbles, those controversial fragments of antiquity that had consumed London's artistic debates, and discovered him already present in the gallery, studying the Parthenon frieze with an intensity that suggested genuine interest rather than mere fashionable attendance. And when he turned to greet her, she saw in his face something beyond the savage mask he wore in society, a thoughtfulness that made him appear younger and somehow more human. "The critics say Lord Elgin has committed theft," he observed, removing these from their rightful place. "But I wonder if preservation of beauty might justify transgression when the alternative is destruction. What is your view, Lady Ashworth?" She moved closer to examine the carved figures, their marble forms still graceful despite damage and time, and considered her words carefully before replying, "I think, Your Grace, that context gives meaning to beauty, and that removing anything from its proper place, however well-intentioned the preservation, leaves it forever incomplete, forever yearning for what was lost." He was silent for a long moment, and she wondered if he understood she spoke of more than marble. The following week, during her customary morning walk through Green Park, where the early light fell gentle through the trees and the fashionable crowds had not yet emerged, she found him walking the same path, and though she told herself it must be coincidence, her heart knew better and beat faster despite her mind's insistence on caution. "You are persistent, Your Grace," she said quietly, "but I cannot fathom why you continue seeking these encounters. Surely a duke has more pressing demands on his time than troubling a widow of no consequence." He fell into step beside her, his long stride adjusted to match her pace, and when he spoke, his voice lacked its usual cutting edge. "Perhaps I have discovered that consequence is a matter of perspective, Lady Ashworth, and that the most consequential encounters are often those society deems insignificant, or perhaps I simply find your company preferable to the fawning desperation that typically surrounds my title. You alone seem neither impressed by my rank nor frightened of my reputation, and I confess I find that quality increasingly rare and infinitely valuable." Weeks passed in this careful pattern of calculated encounters, each meeting revealing layers beneath the savage exterior he showed the world. Yet Beatrice maintained her polite distance, her heart armored against hope, even as her mind acknowledged his apparent sincerity, for she had learned that hope was the most dangerous indulgence for those whom society had deemed irrelevant. The private library of Lord Harrington occupied the ground floor of his Mayfair residence, a cathedral of learning where leather-bound volumes climbed to vaulted ceilings and the scent of old paper mingled with beeswax and the faint mustiness of centuries. And Beatrice had petitioned for access with the formal letter of introduction. Her late husband's scholarly connections had afforded her, never imagining that when she arrived on the appointed Tuesday morning, a portfolio of notes tucked under her arm, to research the evolution of dramatic structure from Aeschylus through Euripides, she would find the Duke of Rothwell already established at the massive oak reading table, surrounded by his own collection of texts that she recognized with a start as editions of Sophocles and commentaries on classical staging. "Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the hushed space where even footfalls seemed an intrusion, "I was not aware you had secured access to Lord Harrington's collection. Had I known, I would have chosen a different day for my research. I would not wish to disturb your work." He looked up from the volume before him, and she saw surprise flicker across his features before being replaced by something that might have been pleasure had she allowed herself to interpret it so generously. "Lady Ashworth, it seems we are destined to pursue parallel paths. I am examining the treatment of fate versus free will in Greek tragedy, a subject I confess has consumed my thoughts of late. Please, the library is vast enough to accommodate us both without disturbance, unless my presence is unwelcome to you." She hesitated in the doorway, acutely aware that accepting meant hours in his company without the buffer of public spaces or the possibility of easy retreat, yet the pull of her research and the rare opportunity to access these precious texts overcame her caution, and she moved to the far end of the table, maintaining what she hoped was sufficient distance while still able to access the relevant volumes. Hours passed in near silence, broken only by the rustle of turning pages and the scratch of pen on paper, and Beatrice found herself gradually relaxing into the companionable quiet, occasionally glancing up to find him absorbed in his work with the same intensity she brought to her own, his harsh features softened by concentration until she could almost forget the savage reputation that preceded him. It was when she encountered a particularly frustrating gap in her understanding of the chorus's role in Agamemnon that she spoke without thinking, more to herself than to him. How is one to reconcile the chorus's knowledge of coming tragedy with their inability to prevent it? They see and yet cannot act. They know and yet cannot save. What purpose does such helpless wisdom serve, except to compound the suffering? The Duke looked up, his pale eyes meeting hers across the expanse of polished wood, and she saw in them a recognition that made her breath catch. "Perhaps," he said slowly, his voice lacking all trace of cutting edge, "the purpose is not to prevent tragedy but to bear witness to it, to ensure that suffering is seen and acknowledged even when it cannot be stopped. The chorus understands what the protagonists cannot yet grasp, that some fates are woven too tightly to unravel, and yet they remain, they observe, they mourn. Is that not a form of courage in itself, to witness pain without turning away?" They spoke then of Cassandra's prophecies and Clytemnestra's vengeance, of how the ancient Greeks understood that wisdom and happiness rarely traveled together, and Beatrice felt the walls she had so carefully maintained begin to tremble as she glimpsed not the feared Duke, but a man of genuine depth and feeling who grappled with the same questions about fate and choice that haunted her own. Sleepless nights, yet even as her heart whispered dangerous possibilities, her mind insisted on caution, reminding her that moments of connection did not constitute promises, and that she had survived too much to risk her hard-won peace on hope that might prove as illusory as Cassandra's unheeded warnings. The whispers began at Lady Thornbury's soirée, where Beatrice had made the grave error of accepting an invitation she should have declined, for she arrived to find the drawing-room already abuzz with speculation about the Duke of Rothwell's unprecedented attention to the insignificant widow, Ashworth, and though she maintained her composure as she took her place near the pianoforte, where the wallflowers traditionally gathered, she could not help but hear Lady Pemberton's voice carrying across the room with deliberate clarity. "My dear Lady Thornbury, have you observed the Duke's peculiar fascination with our little widow? Though I confess I cannot determine whether His Grace is conducting some elaborate jest at her expense, or if he has developed a taste for charity cases. Either way, one must pity poor Lady Ashworth, who clearly mistakes his amusement for genuine interest. How mortifying it will be when he inevitably discards her, as he has discarded every woman who has dared aspire to his notice." The words struck like physical blows, and Beatrice felt the familiar burn of humiliation rise in her cheeks, even as she kept her eyes fixed on her teacup with studied determination, willing herself to remain impassive while the circle of ladies tittered and exchanged knowing glances. Miss Hartwell, a young debutante whose mother had suffered the Duke's cutting dismissal earlier in the season, added with barely concealed malice, "I heard he was seen walking with her in Green Park no fewer than 3 times last week, and that he has been frequenting Hatchard's at the most unfashionable hours. Surely a Duke does not alter his habits for a woman of no fortune or consequence, unless he intends sport of the cruelest kind. Mark my words. Before the month is out, we shall witness the poor widow's humiliation when he turns his attention elsewhere and leaves her the object of London's pity and ridicule." Throughout the remainder of that interminable evening, Beatrice endured the sidelong glances and barely suppressed laughter of those who had marked her as the Tun's next victim of scandal, and though she departed with her dignity intact, she lay awake that night in her small rented rooms, acknowledging the terrible truth that the gossips had articulated what her own fearful heart had whispered all along, that a duke did not truly seek companionship with a poverty-stricken widow, that their encounters must be either elaborate amusement or temporary diversion, and that she had been a fool to allow even the smallest hope to take root in her carefully defended heart. The following days brought more whispers as she moved through London's restricted spaces, hearing her name coupled with the Duke's in tones ranging from mockery to pity, and even her few remaining friends among the respectable but unfashionable set looked at her with concern and gentle warnings about protecting her reputation and her heart. Mrs. Weatherby, her late husband's cousin who had shown Beatrice consistent kindness, spoke plainly over tea in Beatrice's modest parlour. "My dear, I know you are sensible, but I must speak as one who cares for your welfare. The Duke of Rothwell is not a man known for constancy or genuine feeling, and while I do not doubt he finds your conversation stimulating, you must consider what his intentions could possibly be toward a woman of your circumstances. Men of his rank do not marry for intellectual companionship, and anything less than marriage would destroy what little position you retain in society." That night, as rain drummed against her window and the chill of approaching autumn seeped through the thin walls, Beatrice made her resolution with the same quiet determination that had sustained her through her loveless marriage and subsequent widowhood. She would withdraw from the dangerous proximity of the Duke's attention, would return to the safe obscurity that had been her lot before he had noticed her existence, would armor her heart once more against the seductive possibility that she might be seen and valued for herself, rather than dismissed as society had always dismissed her. For she had survived too much to risk her hard-won peace on what could only be temporary notice from a man whose world would never truly accommodate someone like her. The Duke of Rothwell arrived at Hatchard's bookshop on Tuesday morning, as had become his custom these past weeks, only to find the familiar corner where Lady Ashworth typically browsed the philosophy section conspicuously empty, and though he told himself her absence was mere coincidence, when Wednesday brought the same emptiness, and Thursday found him walking the paths of Green Park without encountering her slight figure moving among the autumn-touched trees, he felt something unfamiliar and unwelcome settle in his chest, like a stone dropped into still water. Friday found him at the British Museum during the hours when she had previously examined the Greek artifacts, and when she did not appear he made discreet inquiries of the staff, learning that Lady Ashworth had not visited in over a week, and it was this confirmation of a pattern rather than coincidence that forced him to acknowledge what he had been avoiding, that she was deliberately absenting herself from every place where they had established their careful rhythm of encounter. He returned to his townhouse in a state he could not name, pacing the length of his study while his secretary waited with correspondence that went unread, and his butler hovered with concern for his Grace's unusual agitation, and the Duke found himself reviewing every conversation he had shared with Lady Ashworth, searching for the moment when he might have overstepped or offended, yet he could identify nothing beyond their shared discourse on Greek tragedy and the meeting of minds that had felt to him like the first genuine connection he had known in the years since his heart had learned to armor itself against feeling. He dispatched his most trusted man to make careful inquiries, and what returned to him was not comfort, but rather a more painful understanding, for it seemed that Lady Ashworth had become the subject of society's speculation regarding his attentions, that Lady Pemberton and her circle had sharpened their tongues on Beatrice's reputation, suggesting that the Duke was merely amusing himself with the poor widow before inevitably discarding her to general ridicule, and though his first instinct was rage at those who would dare speak her name with such casual cruelty, beneath the anger he recognized something more devastating, that she had heard these whispers and believed them, that she had judged his interest to be the sport that vicious tongues claimed it was, and that she had chosen to protect herself by withdrawing from his presence entirely. The emotion that filled him then was not the anger he had wielded so effectively to keep the world at bay, but rather hurt, a feeling he had not permitted himself since the day his former fiancée had revealed her mercenary heart, and he understood with sudden clarity that somewhere in the accumulated hours of conversation and the meeting of two lonely minds, Lady Beatrice Ashworth had become essential to him in ways he had not allowed himself to acknowledge until her absence created a void that no amount of solitude could fill. He stood at his study window watching the October rain begin to fall, and recognized that he had reached a precipice, that he must either retreat into the safe cruelty that had protected him for so long, or he must do what terrified him most, which was to pursue her with honest intention and risk the vulnerability he had sworn never to permit again. And as the rain intensified against the glass, he knew that the choice had already been made, for he could no more return to his former isolation than he could forget the way her eyes had lit with passion when she spoke of Cassandra's unheeded prophecies, and he understood that Lady Ashworth had accomplished what no other woman had managed. She had made him feel the absence of her presence as a genuine loss, and that loss demanded he confront what she had come to mean to his carefully defended heart. The November rain arrived without warning as Beatrice hurried along Bond Street, her worn cloak pulled tight against the sudden downpour that transformed the cobblestones into rivers and sent shoppers scrambling for shelter, and she had foolishly dismissed her maid that morning to save the expense of hiring a hackney, a decision she now regretted as the deluge intensified, and her thin boots soaked through within moments, leaving her shivering and half-blind from the water streaming into her eyes. She had reached the corner of Bruton Street, desperately seeking an awning under which to wait out the storm, when the unmistakable crest of the Duke of Rothwell appeared on a coach that drew alongside her with precision that suggested it had been searching, and when the door opened and His Grace himself looked out at her bedraggled form, his expression unreadable, she felt her heart lurch with a confusion of emotions she had spent a month trying to suppress. "Lady Ashworth, you will catch your death," he said, his voice carrying that familiar authority that expected obedience. "Please, allow me to convey you to your residence." She opened her mouth to refuse, pride and caution warring within her even as the rain pelted her mercilessly. But before she could form the words of polite dismissal, a crack of thunder shook the very air and the heavens opened with renewed fury, and she found herself accepting his gloved hand and climbing into the warm, dry sanctuary of his carriage with a surrender that felt like more than mere capitulation to weather. The interior was intimate in the way all enclosed spaces become when occupied by two people who have been avoiding each other. The leather seats gleaming in the dim light filtered through rain-streaked windows, and as the coach lurched into motion, she became acutely aware of his presence beside her, close enough that she could smell the sandalwood scent of his soap and see the tension in the set of his jaw. For several minutes they sat in silence, broken only by the drumming of rain on the roof and the sound of hooves splashing through puddles, and Beatrice kept her eyes fixed on her trembling hands, willing herself to maintain the composure that had become her only defense against a world that saw her as insignificant, until his voice cut through the awkwardness with a directness that made her breath catch. "Why have you been avoiding me, Lady Ashworth?" The question hung between them, impossible to deflect or ignore, and she felt the careful walls she had constructed over these past weeks begin to crack under the weight of his steady gaze, for he was looking at her with an intensity that demanded honesty rather than the polite evasions society preferred. And she found that after a month of loneliness and the echo of their conversations haunting her quiet rooms, she no longer possessed the strength to dissemble. "Because I am not a fool, Your Grace," she said quietly, her voice trembling slightly but her words clear. "I have heard what society whispers about your attentions to an insignificant widow. I have endured the speculation about whether you amuse yourself at my expense or simply tire of more challenging prey, and I will not be the object of London's mockery when you inevitably tire of whatever diversion my company has provided and turn your interest elsewhere. I have survived too much to willingly walk into humiliation with my eyes open." The words emerged like a confession wrung from her careful heart, and she watched his expression shift from surprise to something that looked remarkably like pain, and when he spoke again, his voice carried an intensity she had never heard from him before, not in their sparring over philosophy or their careful discussions of Greek tragedy, but something raw and unguarded that made her forget entirely that they were merely a duke and a dismissed widow, trapped by circumstance in a rain-soaked carriage. "You believe I have been amusing myself with you," he said, and there was genuine hurt in his tone that pierced her defenses more effectively than any declaration might have done. "Lady Ashworth, Beatrice, in the month of your absence I have felt your loss as I have felt nothing. Since I learned to armor my heart against feeling anything at all, you have become essential to me in ways I did not permit myself to acknowledge until the empty corners of Hatchards and the silent paths of Green Park taught me that I could no more return to my former isolation than I could forget. The way your mind meets mine, as no other ever has. The silence that followed his confession stretched between them like something fragile and precious, broken only by the rain's relentless percussion against the carriage roof, and Beatrice found herself staring at the Duke with tears gathering in her eyes that had nothing to do with the cold dampness of her clothes and everything to do with the raw vulnerability she heard in his voice. For this man who had built his reputation on savage dismissals and cutting remarks was speaking to her with a tenderness that pierced every defense she had constructed around her wounded heart. "Your Grace," she began, but he raised a hand to halt her words, and she saw in his expression something desperate and determined that made her breath catch. "No, let me finish, for I have spent 6 years armoring myself against feeling anything beyond contempt for a society that values appearance over substance and ambition over authenticity," he said, his dark eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the small space of the carriage feel charged with electricity. "When Lady Caroline Hartley accepted my proposal 7 years ago, I believed in love and connection and all those pretty sentiments that poets write about, only to discover on the eve of our wedding that she had been carrying on an affair with her father's steward and sought my title merely to legitimize a child that was not mine. And when I confronted her, she laughed and told me I was a fool to think she could ever desire a man as cold as I, that my fortune and position were all she had ever wanted, and something in me died that day. Beatrice, something I believed could never be resurrected." She felt the tears spill over at his use of her given name, at the pain she heard beneath his careful words, and she understood in that moment that his cruelty had never been innate but rather constructed, a wall built brick by brick from betrayal and humiliation, and she recognized in his story echoes of her own marriage to Lord Ashworth, different in specifics but similar in the way both had taught them to guard their hearts against further wounding. "I made myself into something fearsome," he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I cultivated a reputation for savage dismissals and cutting remarks, because if people feared me, they could not hurt me. If they believed me incapable of feeling, then no one would seek to exploit my feelings for their gain, and for 6 years this strategy served me well. I moved through society untouched and untouchable, until the night I saw you standing at the edge of Lady Tremain's ballroom, maintaining your dignity while Lady Pemberton's circle mocked you, and I witnessed in you a strength I had never managed to achieve, and the ability to face cruelty without becoming cruel in return, to survive dismissal without losing your essential kindness." His hand moved as if to reach for hers but stopped midway, hovering in the space between them, and she saw in that aborted gesture how much courage this confession was costing him, how thoroughly he was dismantling the protective armor that had kept him safe from further betrayal. "You have pierced that armor without trying, Beatrice," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Through our discussions of philosophy and tragedy, through your refusal to bow to my reputation, through the way your mind meets mine, as no other ever has, you have made me feel again, and I find that I no longer wish to be untouchable if it means I cannot know the touch of your regard. I no longer wish to be safe from hurt if safety requires me to live without the possibility of your presence in my life." She could not contain the sob that escaped her then, for she understood exactly what he was offering her, not merely his interest or his protection, but his vulnerable heart. And she knew that her response in this moment would determine everything, and that she could retreat into the safety of her own protective walls, or she could meet his courage with her own. "Herr, I have felt it too," she whispered, her voice breaking but her words clear. "This connection between us, that I tried to convince myself, was mere civility or intellectual compatibility. But in the month of avoiding you, I discovered that absence had carved a hollow in my days that nothing else could fill, in that I missed not simply our conversations, but the way you see me as more than a dismissed widow of no consequence, the way you challenge my thinking and respect my opinions, and make me feel as though my mind and my spirit matter to someone in this world that has taught me I am insignificant." His hand finally completed its journey to cover hers, his touch gentle despite the trembling she could feel in his fingers, and the warmth of that contact seemed to travel through her entire body, chasing away the chill of the rain and the cold loneliness that had been her constant companion since Lord Ashworth's death had left her alone in an indifferent world. "Then give me time," she said, meeting his eyes with a directness that cost her everything. "Give me time to trust that this is real and not another cruel jest that society plays on those of us who have learned to expect nothing. Give me time to believe that the Duke of Rothwell truly sees value in the woman society dismisses as irrelevant. And I promise you, I will try to have the courage that this truth deserves, for you have given me your vulnerability, and that is a gift I will not take lightly." He nodded slowly, and she saw in his expression both relief and determination. And though the rain continued to fall and the carriage carried them through London's streets toward her modest residence, something had shifted between them in that intimate space, and something fragile and new, but also strong in its foundation of mutual understanding and shared wounds. And as his thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand, she felt the first stirrings of hope that perhaps, despite everything that had taught them both to guard their hearts, they might find in each other a sanctuary worth the risk of vulnerability. The courtship began 3 days after the rainstorm, not with the grand gestures that society expected from a duke pursuing a lady, but with a small leather-bound volume of Seneca's letters that arrived at Beatrice's modest residence, accompanied by a note in his Grace's precise handwriting that read simply, "I thought you might enjoy this translation, as our discussion of Stoic philosophy seemed incomplete without it." And she found herself smiling at the memory of their conversation weeks ago about whether true tranquility could be achieved through reason alone, touched that he had remembered her arguments and sought to continue the discourse even in her absence. The following week brought an invitation not to a ball or musicale, but to a lecture at the Royal Society on Astronomical Observations, an event she had longed to attend but never dared, as an unaccompanied widow of no consequence. And when she accepted with a carefully worded note expressing her gratitude, she discovered that the Duke had already secured her a place of honor and treated her throughout the evening with a respect that made clear to all observers that she was under his protection, though he made no presumptuous claims upon her attention and conversed with her as an intellectual equal rather than a prize to be won. As autumn arrived and painted London's parks in shades of amber and gold, their meetings became a rhythm that structured her days with anticipation rather than the hollow emptiness that had characterized her widowhood, for he would appear at her door each Wednesday afternoon to escort her to the British Museum, where they would wander among ancient artifacts, discussing history and philosophy. Each Thursday morning found them walking the paths of Green Park, regardless of weather, as he shared with her his passion for landscape architecture and his plans for improving his country estates. And on Saturday evenings he began introducing her to his private world by inviting her to small gatherings at his townhouse, where scholars and poets and artists gathered to debate ideas rather than trade gossip. And she discovered that beneath the savage exterior, London knew existed a man of profound intellectual curiosity and surprising gentleness, who debated fiercely but listened carefully, and whose eyes would seek hers across crowded rooms as though her opinion mattered more than all others combined. She found herself trusting him incrementally through these careful weeks, not through grand declarations or dramatic gestures, but through the steady accumulation of small moments that revealed his character, the way he ensured her comfort without being patronizing, how he introduced her to his circle, not as his latest interest, but as a valued intellectual companion whose insights enriched their discussions, the books he selected for her that showed he had paid attention to every casual comment she had made about her interests, and most tellingly, the patience with which he allowed her to set the pace of their growing intimacy, never pressing for more than she was willing to give, never presuming upon the vulnerability she had shown him in the rain-soaked carriage, but rather honoring it by proving through consistent action that his feelings were genuine and enduring. By the time October's chill settled over London and the trees in the park stood bare against grey skies, Beatrice realized that the walls she had so carefully constructed around her heart had been dismantled, not through force, but through the persistent, gentle erosion of his constancy, and she understood with a clarity that both thrilled and terrified her that she was falling in love with the Duke of Rothwell, not with his title or his fortune, but with the man he revealed himself to be when society's judgment fell away. The brilliant mind that challenged hers, the wounded heart that recognized her own wounds, and the courage it took for someone so hurt to risk feeling again, and she knew that soon she would need to find her own courage to tell him that the time she had asked for had transformed her careful trust into something far more profound and infinitely more dangerous to a heart that had learned to expect disappointment rather than hope for joy. The deepening of their connection arrived not with dramatic revelation, but through the quiet intimacy of conversations that peeled back layers of protective pretense. And it was on a grey November afternoon in the Duke's private study, a room she had been startled to be invited into, for it represented his most personal sanctuary, filled with correspondence and ledgers and private papers that spoke to the man rather than the title, that Beatrice found herself speaking of her marriage to Lord Ashworth with an honesty she had never offered anyone, describing how at 17 she had been given to a man of 63 by a father drowning in debts who saw her only as currency to purchase his freedom from creditors, how her husband had wanted an ornament for his declining years rather than a companion, how she had spent 5 years in a house that felt like a mausoleum, learning to make herself small and quiet and unobtrusive, and how his death had brought not grief, but a terrible guilty relief that shamed her, even as it freed her. And she watched the Duke's expression as she spoke, and saw not judgment, but understanding, and a fury on her behalf that touched her deeply because it came from genuine care rather than performative outrage. "I understand that relief," he said quietly, rising from his chair to stand at the window overlooking his gardens, where the last roses of autumn were surrendering to winter's approach. "When my mother died, I was 14, and I wept not for her loss, but because I knew my father would never again have reason to pretend warmth in her presence, that without her gentle influence to moderate his coldness, I would face the full force of his disappointment in a son he considered too sensitive and too scholarly to properly carry the ducal name, and the guilt of feeling relief at a parent's death is a particular kind of torment, because society tells us we should grieve even when the relationship brought us little but pain." She joined him at the window, standing close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, and in the fading light she could see his reflection in the glass, looking more vulnerable than she had ever witnessed, and she understood that he was offering her his own wounds in exchange for hers, trusting her with truths he had clearly shared with no one else. "He taught me that emotional distance was strength," the Duke continued, his voice rough with old pain, "that to care deeply was weakness, that vulnerability invited exploitation, and by the time I was 20, I had learned those lessons so well that when Lady Caroline betrayed me, I felt almost vindicated, as though my father's teachings had been proven correct, and I had been foolish to ever believe I could be both strong and feeling, both powerful and tender. And I spent 6 years proving to myself and to society that I needed no one and nothing beyond my title and my fortune and my ability to cut down anyone who dared approach me with false sentiment or mercenary intent." She turned, to face him fully then, and when he met her eyes she saw in them a loneliness that mirrored her own, a recognition of what it cost to survive in a society that valued appearances over authenticity and protection over connection, and she reached for his hand with a boldness that surprised her, lacing her fingers through his with a deliberateness that spoke of choice rather than chance. "We are kindred spirits, you and I," she said softly, "both taught by cruel experience to guard our hearts, both wounded by those who should have cherished us, both surviving in a world that dismisses genuine feeling as weakness while celebrating the very manipulation and calculation that wounded us. And perhaps that is why I trust you as I have trusted no one else, because you understand what it costs to lower these walls we have built. You know that vulnerability is not weakness, but rather the greatest courage, and you have shown me through your patience and your constancy that not everyone who approaches seeks to exploit or diminish or use." He raised their joined hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that felt more intimate than any grand gesture could have been, and in that moment Beatrice understood that she had moved beyond the careful trust of their early courtship into something far more profound, that she loved this complex, wounded man who hid his tender heart behind savage reputation, and that despite everything that had taught them both to expect disappointment rather than hope for joy, they had found in each other a sanctuary worth every risk that vulnerability required. The threat arrived on a December morning when frost etched delicate patterns across London's windows, and the city held its breath in that peculiar stillness that precedes catastrophe, and it came in the form of Lady Caroline Hartwell, sweeping back into society after 6 years abroad, with a story calculated to destroy everything that Beatrice and the Duke had so carefully built between them. For the former fiancé had returned from the continent with tales of broken promises and cruel abandonment that painted the Duke as a villain who had cast her aside without cause, and herself as the wounded innocent whose heart had never recovered from his savage rejection, and society ever hungry for scandal and eager to believe the worst of those who dared to defy its expectations, seized upon this narrative with vicious enthusiasm. Within days, the whispers that had begun as speculation about the Duke's courtship of an insignificant widow transformed into certainty that Beatrice had ensnared him through manipulation and scheming, that she had used her pretense of intellectual interests to captivate a man who was clearly still in love with his beautiful former fiancée. And Lady Pemberton led the charge with particular cruelty, hosting a tea where she loudly declared that widows of no fortune who suddenly attracted ducal attention were obviously employing methods that no respectable woman would countenance, and when news of this reached Beatrice through her one remaining friend in society, she felt the old familiar shame threatening to overwhelm her, even as she recognized the injustice of these accusations. The Duke, upon learning of the rumors through his own sources, descended into a rage that reminded all of London why they had feared him, for he appeared at his club and delivered such a savage set-down to Lord Pemberton regarding his wife's gossip-mongering that the man reportedly went pale and stammered apologies, and he made it known through carefully placed words in the right ears that anyone who dared malign Lady Beatrice would face the full force of his considerable displeasure. But Beatrice, when he came to her that evening, still burning with protective fury, surprised him by asking him to cease his defense, to let her handle this challenge in her own way, rather than allowing him to fight her battles as though she were incapable of defending herself. "I have spent my entire life being protected or dismissed or spoken for by men who believed they knew better than I what I needed and what I deserved," she said with a calm that belied the fear churning beneath her composure. "And I love you too much to allow our relationship to follow that pattern, to become another instance of a powerful man shielding a weaker woman from consequences. And these accusations strike at the heart of what we have built together. This idea that I have somehow manipulated you, that our connection is false or calculated, and I need to address that falsehood myself, to stand before society and speak my own truth rather than hiding behind your title and your power, because if I cannot do that, then perhaps Lady Pemberton is right, and I am too weak and too insignificant to be worthy of a duke's regard." He looked at her with an expression that held both admiration and anguish, understanding what she asked, but hating that society's cruelty demanded such courage from her, and he took her hands in his and said with a voice rough with emotion that he would honor her request, though it went against every instinct to let her face this storm alone, and in that moment of trust between them, of him respecting her need to prove her own strength, despite his desire to protect her. Their love deepened even as the world around them grew darker with malicious speculation and fabricated scandal. The opportunity to address her detractors arrived 3 days later at the Countess of Harrington's annual Christmas gathering, an event that drew the entirety of fashionable London and which Beatrice attended despite every instinct urging her to hide, for she understood that avoiding society would only confirm the accusations of manipulation and scheming that Lady Pemberton had so effectively spread throughout the ton, and she entered the glittering assembly in a simple gown of grey silk that made no concessions to fashion or display, her chin held high despite the immediate hush that fell over the nearest conversations, and the way eyes followed her progress across the room with undisguised speculation and judgment. Lady Pemberton stood at the center of a circle of her particular adherents, her voice carrying deliberately across the salon, as she remarked loudly on the audacity of certain persons who refused to acknowledge their proper station. And Beatrice felt the old familiar heat of shame rising in her chest, even as she recognized this moment for what it was. Not a humiliation to be endured, but an opportunity to speak truth that might never come again, and so rather than retreating to the periphery as she had done countless times before, she walked directly toward Lady Pemberton's circle with a calm that surprised even herself, and the room fell progressively silent as guests recognized that something unprecedented was about to occur. "Lady Pemberton," Beatrice said clearly, her voice steady despite her racing heart, You have made certain accusations regarding my character and my intentions toward the Duke of Rothwell, and rather than allow these falsehoods to circulate unchallenged, I would speak plainly before this assembly, so that all might judge the truth for themselves, for I have learned that silence in the face of cruelty is often mistaken for guilt, when in fact it is simply the exhaustion of those who have been dismissed and diminished for so long that defending themselves seems futile. She turned slowly to address the wider room, and across the salon she caught sight of the Duke standing frozen near the entrance, his expression one of fierce pride mingled with concern, but she did not look to him for strength, drawing instead upon reserves of courage she had not known she possessed. You claim I have manipulated his grace through false intellectual pretense and calculated vulnerability, she continued, her voice carrying in the attentive silence. But I ask you to consider what such an accusation truly means. It suggests that a woman of intelligence and genuine feeling is so rare and so unnatural that when such a woman appears, she must be performing a role rather than simply being herself. It suggests that authentic connection between two wounded souls who recognize kindred suffering in each other is impossible, and that all relationships must be founded on calculation and social advantage, and it suggests that I, because I am a widow of modest means and unremarkable appearance, could not possibly attract the regard of a duke through the simple virtue of being a complete person, with thoughts and passions and honest feeling, rather than a decorative ornament designed to flatter masculine vanity. The silence deepened, and Beatrice saw several faces in the crowd shift from judgment to uncomfortable recognition, for she had named the cruel assumptions that governed their society with a directness that left no room for comfortable pretense. The courage required for vulnerability is something this assembly rarely acknowledges, she said more softly, but her words carried nonetheless. For we have built a society that celebrates artifice and calculation, that teaches our daughters to hide their true selves in pursuit of advantageous matches, and our sons to armor their hearts against genuine feeling. And when two people dare to lower those defenses and see each other truly flaws and wounds, and all we call it manipulation rather than recognizing it as the rarest and most precious form of human connection, and I will not apologize for loving a man who sees me as I am, nor for allowing myself to be seen when everything in my experience taught me that invisibility was safety. Lady Pemberton's face had gone rigid with fury and embarrassment, but she could find no response that would not confirm everything Beatrice had said. And in that moment of her silence, the Duke crossed the room with deliberate steps, and when he reached Beatrice, he took her hand in his and raised it to his lips, while holding her gaze with eyes that blazed with love and admiration, and he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the salon, "Lady Beatrice has more moral courage in her smallest finger than the entirety of this assembly possesses collectively, and I count myself the most fortunate of men that she has allowed me to know her true self rather than the mask society would have her wear." And Beatrice felt in that moment not triumph over her detractors, but rather a profound relief that truth had been spoken and heard. And she knew, watching the Duke's face, that he had fallen even more deeply in love with her strength, even as she had discovered depths of courage within herself that years of dismissal and diminishment had nearly convinced her did not exist. The confrontation came 2 evenings later at the Theatre Royal in Covent Garden, during a performance of King Lear that the entire fashionable world had turned out to attend, and Beatrice sat in the Duke's box beside him, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes that turned their direction with undisguised curiosity and speculation. For her speech at the Countess of Harrington's gathering had created a temporary lull in the cruelest gossip, but had not silenced it entirely, and she could feel the tension in the Duke's frame beside her, the way his jaw tightened whenever he caught sight of Lady Caroline Hartwell, holding court in the box directly opposite theirs, with a smile that promised imminent catastrophe. The first act had barely concluded when Lady Caroline rose from her seat with deliberate grace and made her way through the corridor that connected the boxes, and Beatrice knew with cold certainty what was coming even before the woman appeared at their door, her beauty still remarkable despite 6 years abroad, and her eyes holding a calculating gleam that spoke of carefully laid plans about to reach fruition, and the Duke went absolutely still beside Beatrice in a way that reminded her of a wolf scenting danger, his hand tightening on the armrest until his knuckles showed white beneath his gloves. Lady Caroline entered without invitation, her voice pitched to carry to the neighboring boxes, where Beatrice could see faces turned unabashedly toward their drama, and she addressed the Duke as though Beatrice were not present at all, saying with practiced sweetness that she had returned to London specifically to beg his forgiveness for the misunderstanding that had ended their engagement, that 6 years of reflection had shown her the error of her pride and the depth of her regard for him, that she hoped he might consider reconciliation, now that she had matured beyond the foolish girl who had once wounded him so terribly. The Duke's face had gone cold and remote in the way Beatrice had not seen since their earliest encounters. That savage mask he wore when threatened, and she felt her heart contract with the terrible understanding that this moment would define everything between them, that he stood now at a crossroads where one path led back to the protective cruelty that had kept him safe for so long, and the other required him to choose vulnerability and love before all of London society's watching eyes. Lady Caroline continued her performance with practiced skill, speaking of their shared history and similar stations, of how natural their union would be, compared to certain unfortunate attachments that defied all social logic, and her meaning was clear to everyone listening, even as her words remained superficially polite, and Beatrice watched the Duke's profile and saw the war being waged behind his eyes, the old instinct to wound before he could be wounded again, warring with everything that had grown between them over months of careful trust-building and honest revelation. The silence stretched unbearably as the Duke rose from his seat, and Beatrice felt time slow to a crawl as she waited to discover whether the man she loved would prove himself, or whether the armor he had worn so long would prove too heavy to remove. And Lady Caroline smiled with triumphant certainty, as though his standing signaled acceptance of her offer, and in the neighboring boxes Beatrice could hear the rustle of movement as society leaned forward to witness the Duke of Rothwell's choice, and she sat perfectly still, with her hands folded in her lap and her heart breaking with the knowledge that she could not make this choice for him, that he must decide for himself whether love was worth the risk of being seen in all his vulnerability before the very society that had taught him to guard his heart so jealously. The Duke turned from Lady Caroline and looked directly at Beatrice, with eyes that held such naked emotion that she felt her breath catch in her throat, and then in a movement that sent gasps rippling through every box in the theatre, he lowered himself to one knee before her chair, in a gesture so shocking and unprecedented that the very air seemed to still with disbelief, for dukes did not kneel to impoverished widows, and certainly not before the assembled eyes of London society in the most public venue imaginable. And Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes as she understood the enormity of what he was offering her, not merely his hand in marriage, but his complete vulnerability, in the shedding of every protective layer he had worn for so long, the courage to be seen in all his feeling before the very people who had taught him that such exposure was weakness to be exploited. "Lady Beatrice Ashworth," he said in a voice that carried to every corner of the theatre with such clarity and conviction that not a soul could mistake his sincerity, "I kneel before you not as a duke addressing a subject, but as a man who has found in you everything that makes life worth living. And I care not one whit what society thinks of this breach of protocol, because the greatest breach would be failing to honor publicly what you have come to mean to me in private, and I would have all of London know that you possess a strength of character and richness of mind and beauty of spirit that renders every other consideration meaningless, that your courage in speaking truth to cruelty has shown me what true nobility looks like, and it has nothing to do with titles or bloodlines, and everything to do with moral fiber and genuine feeling." He took her trembling hand in both of his, and Beatrice could see Lady Caroline standing frozen in the doorway of the box, with her face gone pale, with shocked comprehension that she had miscalculated catastrophically, and she could hear the rustling whispers spreading through the theatre like wildfire as society struggled to process this unprecedented display. But all of that faded to insignificance as the Duke continued speaking with such raw honesty that she felt her heart would burst with the fullness of feeling it contained. "You have taught me that vulnerability is not weakness but the highest form of courage," he said, his voice dropping lower but losing none of its intensity. "That being truly seen by another soul is worth every risk of pain or rejection. That love, real love, not the calculated arrangements that pass for marriage in our world, requires the courage to lower every defense and trust another person with the tender places we spend our lives protecting. And I am asking you, before all these witnesses who have dismissed you and underestimated you and failed to see your extraordinary worth, to grant me the honor of spending my life ensuring that you are never invisible again, that your brilliance is celebrated rather than hidden, that your strength is recognized and your gentleness treasured. And I am asking if you will consent to be my wife, not because of what society expects, but because we see each other truly and completely and choose each other anyway. The theater had gone absolutely silent, hundreds of people holding their collective breath as they waited for Beatrice's response, and she looked down at this proud, wounded, magnificent man kneeling before her, offering everything he was and everything he had, and she knew that her answer would not only determine their future, but would stand as a testament that genuine love could exist even in the artificial world of the ton, that two people who had been broken and dismissed could find in each other the completion they had never dared hope for. And so she leaned forward and placed her other hand against his cheek with infinite tenderness, and said in a voice that shook with emotion, but carried nonetheless, "Yes, I will marry you, not because you are a duke, but because you are the man who sees me and whom I see in return. And I love you with a fullness I did not know my heart could contain." The tears that spilled down Beatrice's cheeks were witnessed by hundreds of eyes, but she cared nothing for their observation now, as she held the Duke's face between her hands and felt the trembling of his controlled emotion beneath her palms. And she knew that her acceptance alone would not suffice, that this moment required her to match his vulnerability with her own public declaration, to speak truths that would honor the courage he had shown in kneeling before all of London's judgment. And so she drew a steadying breath and turned her gaze to encompass the assembled theater, addressing not just the Duke, but every soul who had dismissed them both as too cold or too insignificant to merit genuine feeling. "I accept your proposal with joy," she said in a voice that gained strength as she spoke. "But I would have all present understand that I am marrying not a title or a fortune, but a man of extraordinary depth and feeling, a man whose brilliant mind has been hidden behind a savage reputation born of necessity rather than nature, a man whose capacity for kindness and tenderness has been concealed beneath armor, forged in the fires of betrayal and disappointment. And I am marrying him because he has shown me that beneath the protective cruelty that London society knows, there exists a soul of profound sensitivity and fierce loyalty and gentle humor that he has trusted me to see when he has shown it to precious few others." She could feel the Duke's hands tightening on hers as she continued, and she saw in the faces around them expressions ranging from shock to genuine emotion, and she pressed forward with the truth that needed speaking, regardless of how society might judge her candor. "We see each other truly," Beatrice declared, her voice ringing clear in the hushed theater, "without the masks that polite society demands we wear, without the artifice and game-playing that passes for courtship in our world. And I love him not despite his fearsome reputation, but because I have been privileged to know the man beneath it, the man who discusses philosophy with passion, who finds beauty in ancient poetry, who has shown me that the heart that has been wounded most deeply is also capable of the most profound love when it finally finds safe harbor. And I would stand before you all and proclaim that his choice to kneel before me is not a lowering of his dignity, but an elevation of us both. Because true love requires the courage to be vulnerable, to be seen in all our flawed humanity, and to trust another soul with the tender places we guard most fiercely." Lady Caroline had fled the box during Beatrice's speech, her face a mask of humiliated fury, and Lady Pemberton sat frozen in her own box, with an expression of stunned disbelief. And Beatrice could see throughout the theater the faces of those who had mocked her transforming, as they witnessed genuine feeling expressed without shame or calculation, and she turned her full attention back to the Duke and said softly, for his ears alone, though all could see the tenderness in her expression, "I choose you as you have chosen me, and I will spend my life ensuring you never regret the courage it took to remove your armor and trust me with your heart." The Duke rose then and drew her to her feet, and before all of London society, he kissed her with such reverent tenderness that several ladies in nearby boxes were seen dabbing at their eyes with handkerchiefs, and the theatre erupted, not in scandal's whispers, but in genuine applause, for even the most jaded members of the ton could recognize when they witnessed something rare and precious. And as Beatrice stood in the Duke's embrace, She understood that they had not merely declared their love, but had transformed its very nature in the witnessing, that by refusing to hide their genuine feeling behind society's acceptable facades, they had claimed for themselves a truth that no gossip or mockery could diminish. The wedding took place 6 weeks after that transformative evening at the theatre, a ceremony held at St. George's in Hanover Square that drew all of fashionable London despite the unseasonable November chill, and as Beatrice walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk that whispered against the stone floors, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes upon her, but found she no longer cared for their judgment, for the only gaze that mattered was the Duke's, as he stood waiting for her, with an expression of such profound love and reverence that several ladies were seen dabbing their eyes before the vows had even been spoken, and when they emerged as husband and wife, the Duke handed her into his carriage with a tenderness that contradicted every savage reputation he had ever earned, and they departed for his estate in Kent, where they spent the first weeks of their marriage in the quiet intimacy of discovering each other without the constant scrutiny of society's watchful eyes. The months that followed brought changes that rippled through London society, like stones cast into still water, for the Duke's transformation from fearsome adversary to devoted husband became impossible to ignore, as he appeared at social functions with Beatrice on his arm, and treated her with such evident respect and affection that even the most hardened cynics found their assumptions challenged, and more remarkably still, the sharp tongue that had once reduced ambitious mammas to tears was now employed in defense of those whom society dismissed or overlooked, so that gradually the Duke and his Duchess became known not for cruelty, but for their championing of intellectual merit over empty pedigree and their genuine interest in substance over superficiality. By spring, their London residence had become the gathering place for a new kind of salon, where poets and philosophers mingled with titled lords, where conversation turned on ideas rather than gossip, where Beatrice presided with a quiet grace that commanded respect rather than demanding it, and the Tun discovered that the wallflower widow possessed depths of learning and wisdom that put many of their celebrated hostesses to shame, and the Duke revealed himself to be a man of surprising wit and generosity, when among those who engaged his mind, rather than merely his title, and together they created a space where genuine connection could flourish amidst a society built on artifice. Their charitable works extended beyond the fashionable causes that society ladies championed for appearance's sake, for Beatrice had known poverty and understood its grinding humiliations, and she used her new position to establish schools for widows and orphans, to fund lending libraries in neighborhoods where books were luxuries beyond reach, to create opportunities for women whose circumstances had rendered them invisible to a society that measured worth in dowries and connections, and the Duke matched her efforts with his own attention to reforming the conditions on his estates, improving housing for his tenants, ensuring fair wages for those who worked his lands, demonstrating through action rather than words that nobility should be measured in moral responsibility rather than merely inherited privilege. Lady Pemberton and her circle of mockers found themselves gradually excluded from the most desirable invitations as society's center of gravity shifted toward the genuine warmth and intellectual stimulation offered at the Rothwell residence, and while they whispered among themselves about the Duke being bewitched and the upstart widow exceeding her station, their venom found fewer receptive ears, as more and more of the Tun discovered that authentic feeling and meaningful conversation provided greater satisfaction than cruel gossip and empty flattery, and the transformation that Beatrice and the Duke embodied together became a testament to the truth that two wounded souls who found each other could heal not only themselves, but cast light into the darkness that surrounded them, showing others that vulnerability was strength, and genuine love was worth every risk society claimed it carried. 5 years had passed since that November wedding, and the spring afternoon found Beatrice seated in the sunlit drawing room of their Kent estate, with their 3 children gathered around her as she read aloud from a volume of Greek myths, her voice bringing life to the tales of gods and heroes, while 7-year-old Thomas listened with rapt attention. 5-year-old Catherine asked endless questions about why Athena sprang fully formed from Zeus's head, and 3-year-old James contented himself with building towers from wooden blocks at her feet, and through the open windows came the scent of apple blossoms and the sound of birdsong that spoke of renewal and growth, and Beatrice paused in her reading to watch her children's faces and felt a contentment so profound It still sometimes surprised her with its intensity, this life, so different from the lonely widowhood she had endured in those dark months before the Duke had entered her world and transformed everything. The door opened and the Duke himself appeared, no longer addressed with formality even by the servants when the family was private, carrying an armful of tulips from the garden with soil still clinging to their roots because he had pulled them up in his enthusiasm rather than cutting them properly, and the children abandoned Beatrice immediately to rush to their father with cries of delight, and she watched as he knelt to embrace them all, his expression suffused with such open joy that no trace remained of the savage Duke who had once terrorized London society. And when his eyes met hers over their children's heads, she saw in them the same deep love that had been kindled in that bookshop years ago, and had only grown richer and more complex with time and shared experience and the building of this life together. After the children had been sent to wash for tea, the Duke came to sit beside Beatrice on the settee and took her hand in his, and she leaned against his shoulder in comfortable intimacy as they looked out at the gardens they had planted together, the paths they had walked 1,000 times in discussion and companionship, the estate that had become not just a property but a home built on mutual respect and genuine affection. And he said quietly, "Do you ever think about that night at the theatre, when I made such a spectacle of us both?" And she smiled and replied, "I think of it often. How terrified you must have been to kneel before all those judgmental eyes. How much courage it required to show your heart when you had spent so many years protecting it." And he kissed her temple and murmured, "I was terrified, but more terrified of losing you, of returning to that cold isolation I had thought was safety, but was merely existence without meaning." They sat in silence for a moment, hands clasped, hearts aligned, and Beatrice reflected on the journey they had traveled together, from that ballroom where she had stood invisible and dismissed, to this drawing room where she was cherished and seen, from his armor of cruelty to his capacity for tenderness, from two wounded souls circling each other warily to this profound partnership that had weathered society's scorn and emerged stronger for it, and she understood with crystalline clarity that their love had not merely survived but had flourished because they had chosen vulnerability over protection, authentic feeling over convenient facades, and each other over the easier path of remaining safely alone. And when their children's laughter echoed from the hallway announcing their return, she squeezed the Duke's hand and whispered, "We built something beautiful from our brokenness." And his answering smile told her he understood exactly what she meant, that this domestic happiness, this family, this life of purpose and meaning was the truest victory either of them could have claimed. Dear listener, as we close this story of Beatrice and her Duke, of the wallflower who bloomed and the savage heart that learned to soften, perhaps you have recognized in their journey something of your own struggles with invisibility or dismissal, those moments when society has looked past you as though you were merely decoration rather than a soul of depth and worth. And I wish for you to understand that those who stand at the periphery often possess the clearest vision of truth, for they are not blinded by the glittering distractions that captivate those at the center, and they develop strengths that the celebrated never require: the strength of self-reliance, the courage of quiet dignity, the wisdom that comes from observation rather than adulation. Beatrice's story teaches us that true power lies not in commanding attention, but in maintaining authenticity, when the world demands performance, not in conforming to expectations, but in knowing one's own worth regardless of external validation, and that those who dismiss you reveal their own limitations rather than yours, for they lack the perception to see beneath surfaces to the substance that matters, and their judgment says everything about their poverty of spirit and nothing about your value. Consider, too, the Duke's transformation, which reminds us that the armor we construct to protect ourselves from pain often becomes the prison that prevents us from experiencing joy, that cruelty born of hurt only perpetuates suffering and isolates us further, and that the greatest courage is not in maintaining our defenses, but in lowering them for the right person, in choosing vulnerability over safety, in risking the pain of rejection for the possibility of genuine connection. Their love story affirms that true partnership requires seeing and being seen without pretense, that lasting affection grows not from passion alone, but from mutual respect, shared values, and the daily choice to honor each other's complexity, and that the strongest bonds are forged between those who have known suffering and chose gentleness anyway. who have been wounded and chose to remain open-hearted, who understand that every soul carries scars and that compassion is the only reasonable response to our shared human fragility. So if you find yourself overlooked at life's grand ball, standing in shadows while others dance in light, know that your worth is not diminished by their blindness, and that somewhere another soul is seeking exactly what you are: authenticity, depth, understanding, connection. And when you meet, you will recognize each other, not through superficial attributes, but through the resonance of kindred spirits who have traveled similar paths through loneliness toward belonging. May you have the patience to wait for such recognition rather than settling for lesser connections that diminish you. May you maintain your integrity when the world rewards artifice. May you find the courage to be vulnerable when someone proves worthy of that trust. And may you build a life of meaning rather than merely appearance, of genuine feeling rather than empty gesture, of love that sees you truly and cherishes what it finds. May your nights be peaceful and your heart be light, dear listener, and may you remember that the wallflower often blooms most beautifully when tended by hands that recognize its worth. This story comes to you from Love and Deepness, where we explore the complexities of the human heart and celebrate stories of transformation, redemption, and the triumph of authentic love over superficial judgment. And if this tale has touched you, I invite you to share it with others who might need its message, to subscribe so these stories can continue to find you, and to remember always that your worth exists independent of who perceives it, waiting only for you to claim it fully.